All right. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So welcome to this session at the WTO Public Forum. This is on the WTO reform agenda in support of decent work and just development. And I apologize for the late start and the technical difficulties that we're having here in Geneva, but welcome. So real quickly, my name is Eric Gottwald. I'm the Trade Policy Advisor with the AFL-CIO, the Union Federation based in Washington, DC. And we have a great panel to explore this topic today. I'm going to briefly introduce the three panelists. With me here in Geneva is Richard Kozel-Wright, the director of UNCTAD of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies. He's an economist and an expert on too many topics for me to cover here, and he's of course, well known here at the WTO and these circles. We also have joining us remotely Sharon Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation since 2010. And Sharon is, in addition to being a longtime trade unionist from Australia with the education workers, she has been a member of the governing body of the International Labor Organization, in addition to holding many positions with the predecessor of the ITUC, and of course is an expert on labor issues and integrating labor into the global economy. We also have Anita Ramasastry. Anita is a professor, the Henry M. Jackson Endowed Professor of Law at the University of Washington School of Law in Seattle. And she is an expert in many fields, including business and human rights. She's also vice chair of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So I think we have a great panel to explore this issue of how the WTO can create decent work and integrate labor and other issues into the global trade system. I'm going to start with just, I think, a very few high-level reflections before turning to our panelists. I think if we look back, despite the Marrakesh Declaration's commitment to sustainable development, to raising wages, to things like full employment, the WTO has effectively sidelined labor rights and environmental issues, in the name of pursuing a more narrow neoliberal vision that seeks to sort of deepen global trade and remove regulations. And I think the assumption is these other issues will be dealt with elsewhere, and we'll all be better off for it. At the same time that these issues have been sidelined, we've had various WTO members, including the United States, including the European Union and others, who have not sat still on the issue of integrating labor and sustainable development into trade. The United States most recently passed the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, which has really groundbreaking and deep integration of labor rights into the agreement and enforceable against both governments and corporations. If we look at what's happening with trade and forced labor, we can see that now the United States has banned the import of products made with forced labor, is increasingly enforcing that ban. And the European Union recently announced that they will move to adopt a similar ban on products made with forced labor. And lastly, there's obviously been, I think, a lot of activity in the business and human rights space. And I think Anita can help us to speak to that. And just to highlight a few things, the government of France and more recently Germany have enacted mandatory human rights due diligence laws, with effective financial and regulatory penalties for companies that are not doing due diligence and respecting labor rights and human rights throughout their supply chains. So a lot has happened since that Marrakesh Declaration. And as we come up to MC12, I think the question for the panel, and I guess I'd want to start with Sharon Burrow, is what reforms are necessary for the WTO to effectively integrate labor standards into the global trade system? So Sharon, why don't we start with you, and then we'll move to our other two panels. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. And I hope the sound is okay from this end, because I must say you're breaking up and I'm getting some echo. So let's see how we go. But it's great to be with you, and thank you, Richard and Anita, for joining this discussion, because there's no doubt that we think with the fragility of states, with the fracturing of not just the labour market, with now 60% of workers working informally, but precarity growing in the 40% of the formal labour market, with almost no social protection, and with a global trading system that has made us many times wealthier, but only for the few. And it's based on dehumanizing exploitations in those supply chains that make it possible. We need to change, or we will see simply a greater splintering of the cohesion that the world needs to rebuild. So when you look at the birth of, indeed, the WTO, as Eric said, there was great hope. It wasn't the original commitments established, but it was a commitment to say we need full employment. Sorry. It's just too, is it too uncomfortable for people? No? Okay, so we are actually seeing a terrible situation where those principles that were established that said full employment is essential to the social base of cohesion. Well, look at today and the impact not just on massive inequality, on and indeed the climate emergency, but on the impact of COVID-19. And after this, I will talk to the UN commitment to an accelerator that puts jobs and social protection at the heart. But we shouldn't have to do that somewhere else. We should be doing it in a cohesive way. And as Eric raised, if the WTO doesn't reform, if trade sits outside of the global norms of human and labour rights, of environmental standards, then we continue to see the distrust that is actually driving the world now, where people simply don't have a trust in multilateralism. So we need a global trade body, but when you've got this splintering where the current trade body actually won't take responsibility for a floor of social and environmental standards as a fair competition base, and then you've equally got an environment where, in fact, other areas of the community are moving with bilateral trade agreements, multilateral trade agreements, where labour rights and compliance, or environmental standards and compliance are increasingly respected. You can't have these two worlds and pretend we've got a cohesion for growth, for inclusion, for people and the planet. It should be at the centre now of the way we think about recovery, resilience, and inclusive future. So what do we want? Well, we do want to see labour and human rights with environmental standards as a fair competition floor. There should be no company, no government who actually wants to trade on exploitation. It doesn't help the poorest countries, and it doesn't indeed stack up for trust if the richest countries are simply continuing not just to trade on this basis, but indeed for the 1%, not even their own people, in a more equitable frame. When you look at the forthcoming ministerial, then it can make a start. First of all, vaccine inequality is the very example at the heart of why global trade is failing. If you don't have not just a temporary waiver of the TRIPS agreement, but indeed an industry policy frame that allows for knowledge and technology sharing and production more broadly, we don't develop the capacity to deal with this crisis in health or to potentially mitigate or address future crises. And again, it's simply making more billionaires at the risk of inequality around the world. But then we want to see the first step towards integrating and tackling the issues for labour and human rights. If we set up a WTO committee equivalent to the Environment Committee, and it has both the social partners and the ILO, as well as WTO leaders, then we can make a huge difference to the way we charter a course to make labour standards, environmental standards, and human rights as a foundation, alongside due diligence that's increasingly being mandated by the European Union, as Eric said, beginning with France and Germany, but now with the commitment of the EU, and indeed some of those other legislative frames around forced labour and child labour and customs laws in the US, but also due diligence legislation in the UK, in Australia, in the Netherlands, in other areas. This must in fact be a place where we can look at integrating and building cohesive systems of governance, of due diligence, and of compliance. And then I have to say something about e-commerce, because we've already seen that there's been no risk analysis done in too many other areas of trade before you've seen agreements. If there isn't a suspension of e-commerce negotiations with a real capacity for risk analysis around both the impact on the services, the rights, the sovereignty of people and their governments, but also the risks of the dependence on AI or algorithms that actually haven't been tested for bias, for the cultural norms and differences, and of course, how you see, just as we've seen in the big technology companies or the vaccine pharmaceutical companies, the accumulation of power and global monopoly power and wealth that actually denies people rights and access to vital services and products in too many areas. If we learned anything from the COVID-19 pandemic, it was that those essential services, the capacity of governments to make rapid decisions to mitigate and offset the crisis, whether it's in social protection, whether it was in health, whether it was in indeed other areas of support for their own workers, their economies, for parents, and for those that fell sick, then we have no idea, because we've not seen a risk analysis of what these negotiations will mean. You've seen many papers written, they raise alarm, but for countries, a small group of countries, to push on with these negotiations without considering the impact of the risks of further global monopoly power is just extraordinary, and it must actually be halted while we all think about this with some seriousness. On fishing, and agricultural agreements, I won't labour this point, but if we don't actually tackle overfishing, if we don't protect the global marine ecosystem, and if we don't make sure that there's decent work and the elimination of forced and child labour in the supply chains of these industries, then again, that overlap of environment and labour rights will not be dealt with, and we will see greater instability in the food system. We've just got through the UN Food Summit. If we want to deal with these questions, then they have to include dealing with them on an inclusive base with fair rules and capacity for governments to act, rather than asserting again global monopoly power. And finally, we need to reaffirm commitment to the development goals. You can't have SDG commitments by 2030 and have a global trading system that often operates against the very ambitions of that. We all know that the Doha round's never been concluded. We know that people should have a discussion about where development needs to be indeed updated in terms of policy. And we talked already about industry policy for vaccine, but what does just development look like? And what does a global system of trade mean to assist that development, not to mitigate against it by the power of the few? So there's no doubt that all those agendas that began even before the Doha Agreement need to be updated. And again, we need to relook at the alignment of trade and the SDGs. I would simply say to you, for the World Trade Organization to rebuild its legitimacy, rebuild trust in globalization, to truly deliver and contribute to a recovery with a foundation for resilience, with a respect for the social contract with people that includes human and labour rights, and of course that creates decent work through full employment, which of course was initially part of it, as well as the distribution of wealth to improve living standards, then we need to look at genuine reform of the rules and the practice of the WTO. Shared prosperity can only be driven by ensuring people and planet are at the heart of a fairer and a climate-proof system of global trade. So I thank you all for thinking about these issues as you go into the debates, both in the public forum, but also what is the global architecture we need to see in place from the ministerial that will follow in a few short weeks. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Sharon. I think Sharon raised some great points around the development effects of having sidelined labor rights and other issues at the WTO. And so I think it makes sense to turn to Richard Kozel-Wright now for some of his thoughts on this.
Thanks, Eric. Am I speaking into the right microphone? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, thanks, Eric, and thanks, Sharon, to that introduction. I mean, there's a lot there that is very much in line with the way in which we look at these challenges. I would pick up in a way from where you left off and where Eric began by saying that the WTO has traditionally ignored labor and environmental rights. I mean, we would also argue that it's also ignored development, of course, and the right of developing countries to be able to forge the kind of development strategies that they need to raise the living standards of the vast majority of population, most of whom I think it's important to recall are either in agriculture or in the informal sector in the urban economy, and therefore job creation is, you know, a paramount challenge in that context. And, you know, for us, and if you put development with labor and environmental challenges, then the need for developing countries to have adequate policy space is paramount, because all of these challenges and certainly together raise issues of policy trade-off, priority setting, all these traditional kind of state challenges that have become all the more complicated over the last 30 or 40 years, in part because of the reduction of policy space that is available to developing countries and the kinds of rules that were implemented in the Uruguay round have certainly been a major impediment to the kind of development ambitions of many developing countries. And unless we have the notion of policy space, I think, at the center of thinking about reform of the WTO, it's going to be difficult to make progress across the range of challenges that Sharon talked about. So that issue, I think, of policy space needs to be really up front and center in any discussion. And it raises issues, I think, not only about adding to the WTO agenda. I think there's a serious set of questions about should we, and if so, can we, and how do we roll back some of the excessive restrictions that have been introduced by the Uruguay round. That's obviously the case with intellectual property, which is, as Sharon kind of indicated, is a growing source of inequality, both within and across countries. I mean, the control of intellectual property, clearly with the digital economy, but it's not just a problem of the digital economy, gives corporations a huge amount of power to shape the rules of the game and the outcomes in a way that benefits a relatively small percentage of the population. So there's a real issue around rollback that I think we do need to talk about. In terms of the issue around labor standards, I mean, I have to say, I always go back to the Havana Charter on these issues, because of course the Havana Charter was, labor standards were part of the Charter. And one thing about the Charter, unlike the Washington-based institutions, the ITO was signed, the majority of signatures to the ITO were developing countries, actually. People sometimes forget about that. But the point about the Charter and the point about the way in which they understood the challenge around labor standards, it was very much embedded in a wider set of a wider agenda that recognized that, you know, labor standards are closely linked to productivity issues. Productivity issues in the South were closely linked to the industrialization challenge that most of those countries were facing, and that you need a kind of integrated package if you're going to bring these these various challenges into a coherent whole. And we've lost, I think, at the multilateral level, we've lost a lot of that coherence. You know, issues get siloed very quickly. Trade is an issue for the WTO. Finance is an issue for the World Bank. Human rights is an issue for the Council. And that kind of siloed approach is, I think, given the nature of the challenges we face, detrimental to kind of meeting the SDGs, as Sharon rightly recognized, as a central platform now for the international community to make progress. So this breaking down some of those silos, I think, is imperative if we're going to have an agenda that works not only for the disadvantage within countries, but also the disadvantages across countries, and ensures that developing countries not only have the policy space, but the resources available to meet what we all recognize to be an incredibly ambitious agenda, Sharon. I mean, the SDGs is a massive investment push on an unprecedented scale. It cannot be fulfilled without huge investments. Developing countries, large parts of them, simply cannot make those investments given the kind of stresses they face with the levels of debt they acquired even before COVID hit and have increased since COVID. And so unless we have debt relief, debt cancellation as part of an integrated package, you can kiss the SDGs goodbye. It's not deliverable. Right? It's simply not deliverable by 2030. So we need this kind of integrated package, I think, to be able to make progress on these fronts. And I worry, at least, that we don't have a multilateral system that really kind of looks at the challenge in that more integrated manner. I'll leave it there, Eric.
Thank you, Richard. Well, let's turn now to Anita Ramasastry, who is an expert in business human rights, and we've heard in Sharon and Richard's comments at least some mention of this is not just about governments. It is about corporations, and I wonder, I guess for Anita, how do they fit in this picture? And how do you see the WTO potentially integrating respect for business and human rights into its agenda? So go ahead, Anita.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. And it was good to hear Sharon and Richard's interventions, which I agree with. I'm sitting here in my kitchen in Seattle, Washington, which in 1998 was the place known as the Battle in Seattle, where a WTO ministerial went awry because there were protests from environmentalists, people concerned about the impacts of globalization, labor rights, et cetera. And it's just interesting to reflect that we're still having many of the same debates that were really raised a long time ago. I'm a professor who teaches actually sustainable development. And so I think we need to say that everywhere else, I think, save for maybe the WTO and to some extent the international financial institutions, we've already moved on to an integrated approach. The SDGs really ask us to tackle the grand challenges of inequality, poverty, sustainability, and to think about them in an integrated way where just development, human rights, labor rights, environment, but underpinning that economic activity all need to be thought about in a holistic manner. So what I see now as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Richard mentions the silos. I come to Geneva to work at the UN Human Rights Council as an expert and advise governments in that capacity. We knock on the door of the WTO, but the WTO treats itself still as a much more technical body focused exclusively on trade. So you have this world where multinationals who are acting globally are meant to somehow deal with these worlds in sort of different buckets. But what you will see is that in the human rights world and in intergovernmental fora elsewhere, we've already started to see, as Sharon mentioned in her remarks, an integrated approach. So while the WTO has not yet brought on labor and human rights and environmental safeguards as a floor, as we're all, I think, advocating for, what you see over in the Human Rights Council is the UN Guiding Principles in Business and Human Rights. And Guiding Principle 10, which states and governments have already committed to and recently recommitted after a decade, is this concept of policy coherence at the multilateral level. So Guiding Principle 10 speaks about how governments not only need to nationally make sure that their policies and processes which govern companies are respectful of human rights and labor rights, but that they also have a duty and obligation to do the same thing at the multilateral level, including trade. So our working group, when we go on country missions around the world in all continents, what we have seen and what we focus a lot on is the impact of trade and investment from export processing zones to investment promotion agencies, and the disconnect between government policies on those topics from human rights impacts that then follow when you ignore those social safeguards as part of an integrated policy. So our reports very much focus on the trade dimension. And I lead our work on trade, and we've done a lot of work on issues of, for example, trade promotion and export credit, and how integration is possible of human rights, but why it's also so important. And we have a recent report that's coming out to the General Assembly focusing on investment agreements, but much of what we say in that report could apply to trade agreements as well. So the UN and the guiding principles recognize that integration is important, but yet the Human Rights Council, of course, is not going to be the leading entity where companies are going to come in and help shepherd new policy relating to trade and investment. This is why we do need the WTO to, similarly to the Council, to open up and say, okay, it's important for us to also consider these issues. But in the meanwhile, I think this is what Sharon and Eric, you referred to this in your introduction, is that we've seen in a piecemeal way the fact that in other places, this integration has taken place. So the OECD, for example, thinks about responsible business conduct as not just about human rights, but looks at it as an integrated package that deals with a variety of issues so that businesses behave responsibly and fairly in markets around the world. So the OECD has an integrated approach. And what we have is, of course, national and regional regulation that already say it's possible to ask businesses to conduct their business responsibly and respectfully across borders. That is human rights due diligence, asking businesses to take into account the impact of their business activity wherever it happens to be. Now, we've mentioned the French and German mandatory human rights due diligence laws and the European Commission process, which is underway. But we also have, and we've had for much longer, commodity-based legislation as well. We have conflict minerals legislation, began in the US, but we have EU. We have conflict timber. We're looking now at fishing. And so when we talk about trade in particular sectors and goods, we've also seen that it is possible to come up with standards that really help the private sector to operate to a universal, respectful standard across borders. And this is what we would ask the WTO to look at as well. Rather than for, I think, the private sector to have different standards and different regulations cropping up in different places, it would be, I think, again, back to guiding principle 10, policy coherence, much more important to recognize that the global trading system and the WTO is the place to have these discussions and to really set that minimum floor. So the working group's advice back into the WTO echoes what Sharon and Richard have said, which is, again, we don't prescribe the mechanism for getting there, but we would say that it is important to think about trade, environment, labor, and human rights as an integrated package. And we have ample evidence and state practice from a variety of other places that show us that this is not only possible, but necessary. So thank you.
Thank you, Anita. I'm looking here and we have room for questions from any of the participants. So if you have that, feel free to put them in the chat. I want to start with a question using the moderator's privilege. I remember dating all the way back to Singapore, ministerial, and Seattle, a real divide between developing and developed countries around the idea of integrating labor standards into the WTO. This tension, no doubt, still exists. And so my question for the panelists is, how can this be addressed? The suspicion maybe that adding labor standards into WTO is more about protectionism by northern countries, as opposed to, sort of, as Sharon put it, building a floor beneath global competition based on the sort of core ILO labor standards that countries have agreed to. So let me put that out there and see what do y'all think.
Well, I'm keen to know what Richard and Anita think about this, Eric, but I would say that that whole debate around protectionism was a construct to actually oppose the rights of working people, because you've seen major corporations throwing millions and millions and millions of dollars at governments not to actually regulate the labour market, because it would be a barrier to foreign direct investment or trade. If you look at it from a different perspective, and I think here really, you know, Anita with the rule of law is right, that you have to start from first principle. What is the floor of rights and dignity for all people, irrespective of profit, trade, corporate rights, etc. But then, Richard, if you turn it around and think about redistribution, if workers have indeed safe workplaces, secure workplaces with living minimum wages and indeed collective bargaining and a social protection law, then all the evidence I know actually says this grows economies. It's how the Nordic economies grew. They were poor a century ago. They're not poor now. They're the richest countries and the most cohesive in the world. So somehow we have to show these governments two realities. One is, if they really want to develop their country, then yes, they need policy space, industry policy, finance or fiscal space, all of that. But they need to have the capacity for their people to share in the wealth and to have it redistributed in a virtuous circle. But the second is, if you don't address it, then the despair that people are feeling from being excluded. You know, the pandemic lost created a loss of $800 billion for women alone because women were thrown out of the labour market. How is that, you know, a kind of flaw for resilience, for building economies? If you had universal social protection, if women had greater rights to employment protections, then at least you would have mitigated some of that. So, Richard, Anita, I'm really keen to hear what you say, but I do accept here this has been the nexus for people who want rights and environmental standards for, you know, almost 2 decades.
Happy to pick up very briefly on that. And I would say that the question of developed versus developing and whether there's protectionism sort of built in to the debate, I think we have to step back and say that in the 1990s, we were having a very different debate over development and what was the right economic prescription for countries to move forward. I think since then, and Richard can speak to this more aptly, we now consider there are multiple different ways in which states and governments can lead economic development, which isn't sort of the Washington consensus, but moves beyond that, with a different role for the state and a different role for the state in terms of how it invests in its people and provides a general framework. So I would say that it's not just about the narrow issue of labor standards, but that we also have to think about sort of models of development and the role of government as a separate discussion. But I think what we also need to think about is that we've had many events that have happened since the 1990s, from the Rana Plaza disaster to the pandemic, which have shown us that resilience and investment in workers and people, whether it's because companies selfishly want their supply chains to be intact, as we're seeing now, or because that what they really realize is that a healthy, resilient workforce is needed around the globe, means that when we think about what the floor should be, the debate has changed. And as you're hearing from the three of us, when we're talking about what the floor is, it's not a narrow discussion or debate on wage, right? That if we just get stuck on the issue of wage, then that's where the debate, I think, starts to go askew. When we're talking about a package of labor and human rights that governments have already committed to through the SDGs that are really important. So we've heard about safety and security, education. I mean, there are any number of issues that I think are part of what the floor is beyond the wage as the kind of sole driver.
Yeah, sorry. I think Anita's right, but the problem is that if you don't get the wage story right, you're not going to get anything else right. That's just the truth of the matter. And you know, it's not just that the developing countries have not got the wage story right. It's that developed countries have not got the wage story right. The disconnect between wages and productivity in the advanced economies begins well before the Uruguay round and the WTO came into operation. In the United States, it dates to the early 70s. In Europe, it dates to probably to a little bit later in many cases. And you know, in response to Eric's question, I mean, there has been a breakdown of trust in the WTO context, clearly between developed and developing countries. And part of that is a feeling, you know, is a sense of hypocrisy. The developing countries basically believe that they are being told to play by a different set of rules from the advanced economies. And when the rules need to be broken, it will be the advanced economies that break the rules, as they have done during this pandemic, of course, right? So this sense that there's a different set of rules for developing countries from the advanced economies is I think, you know, reinforcing a sense that negotiations don't take place in good faith. The kind of concerns that developing countries have expressed around development are not taken seriously. That, you know, as Sharon said, the Doha development round is treated as being over by advanced economies, even though it's not technically over. It hasn't been shut down as such. And these features of the system, I think, are a real source of conflict and antagonism that need to be overcome if we're going to get to the more integrated approach that I think we all agree needs to be part of the way in which trade policy is thought about. So I think there are some real fundamental political economy issues that need to be far more frankly discussed and recognized by the advanced economies. To be quite frank, I don't think they really recognize the kind of challenges that developing countries face. And the pandemic, developed countries are now talking about coming out of the pandemic, recovery, vaccination. This pandemic has hit most developing countries harder than the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. And the response from the multilateral and international community has been pitiful in terms of providing the necessary support. And this sense of a double standard, I think, is eating away at the core of the multilateral system and the sense that everyone is in this together, because most developing countries don't feel that they're in the same boat as everybody else. And I think we need a more root and branch discussion of the weaknesses of 40 years of neoliberalism as it's impacted on the way in which multilateral institutions operate than I think too many advanced economies are willing to have at this moment in time. And that's a worry for us.
Thanks, Richard. So we have a question here, and I think it's quite a good one. How could the WTO address forced labor? We've seen I think probably the most forward-leaning movement among member states has been on this question of forced labor and human trafficking. Countries have adopted various measures. I've already discussed a number of them, from import bans to mandatory due diligence. How could this issue be integrated into the WTO? I guess maybe the question is it a good starting point? Is it low-hanging fruit? I guess we'll go first to Sharon Burrow.
So it certainly should be low-hanging fruit, Eric. There's not much that is a more serious scourge on morality than work that is based on forced labor. If you take our fight against the kafala system, then you see a modern slavery framework where an individual is effectively owned by one other person, the employer. Everything they do, from the contract, which they often have no legal status to defend, to the residency permit, to accommodation, to the wages they're paid, to the leave entitlements, to the nature of working conditions, all dependent within too many, no recourse to rights or justice by one other person. Human trafficking, particularly in labour, is just different deviations of the reality of, absolute denial of fundamental human or labour rights. And of course, you can't ignore child labour in that context either. So if the WTO, if members of the WTO can't say we will not allow global trade to be based on the depravity of forced labour, then I have to say, why would we accept that any country leader can defend their advocacy for people in their own country or in other countries on any other issue at all? This is a really flawed test. Will leaders in the world take the measures, the ones you've talked about, mandated due diligence with indeed grievance and remedy, but legal compliance? Will they take this responsibility for ending forced labour seriously?
Anita or Richard?
In terms of a specific example, and I was just looking for it now, the US did make a submission, and again, this is at a smaller level, in terms of looking at illegal, underreported fishing and exploited fishing. The idea of, again, creating a reporting mechanism where states would report in about incidences of forced labor in the fishing sector. This is a small move, but again, it was really trying to connect issues of subsidies and unfair competition directly to forced labor in a particular sector, and really, again, noting that forced labor and elimination of forced labor should be a key trade issue. So while the US proposal, which was tabled, I think in May, was an attempt to deal with the issue on a narrow basis, again, I think it's just a sign of what's possible, and again, what we should be thinking about in a much broader way.
Yeah, it's a bit outside my jurisdiction. This issue again. I would simply say that, you know, developing countries feel that there are many, you know, the abuse of corporate power and the way in which that distorts their trading opportunities, which are huge for many developing countries, is not being tackled in the WTO. And so for them to be forced into what they see as a, you know, a less significant factor in terms of their integration into the global economy, and to do and in a way that creates the virtuous circle that Sharon talked about. Again, I just think it reflects this sense that developing, the real challenges, the structural challenges that developing countries face are not being properly tackled as they're being asked to deal with these other issues, which are, I think most countries recognize are critical. But, you know, in a world in which development is constrained in so many ways, become, you know, that many firms get forced into these kind of labor practices. I think it's imperative again to put this in these kinds of issues, which, you know, I think we think are important, into the larger context, to be able to generate the kind of environment of trust where they can be effectively dealt with by what ultimately is the way to deal with these problems, which is through domestic regulation. That's the way the West, the advanced economies, dealt with these problems, and it will be ultimately the way that developing countries deal effectively with these problems. But, you know, unless we can get, you know, a degree of trust back into the system, I think trying to impose these onto a system that is already heavily biased and skewed against developing countries just leads to this atmosphere where, in a sense, an atmosphere of bad faith. And I think we need to get over that fairly urgently, given the seriousness of the challenges and the global challenges that we all face.
Well, thanks all three of you for weighing in on that question. I guess we have time for one more. We have a question on agriculture, and specifically global agriculture. And the question is how, if we're to create a social floor, when it comes to agriculture, how do you create a social floor when so many countries are engaged in agriculture at different levels of development? So I think the question goes mainly to the wages, but maybe standards is relevant too. And I'll just put it out to the group here. Maybe Richard, you want to start, and instead of Sharon, since I keep going to Sharon first.
Not really, Eric, to be honest.
Or maybe Sharon.
I mean, I have a very crude, I mean, my understanding of this I'm a very crude development economist. I mean, you know, agriculture, as we know, tends to be a more precarious activity than, at least traditionally, than manufacturing and services. And the job of a kind of healthy development path is to get people out of agriculture into the better paid manufacturing and service sectors of the economy. One of the big problems, again, for developing countries is, as they have faced this much more restrictive international regulatory environment, many of them have not been able to develop the kind of manufacturing dynamism that normally, under a healthy kind of economic environment, sucks out labor into that more dynamic sector, which we know, which is not. I mean, it's often a very difficult environment for workers, of course, but it's better than what they came from. And the problem in a world where you have premature deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing capacity at what are relatively low levels of income, that kind of channel for a healthy development dynamic has been lost. And that is, I think that, that is that kind of structural problem underpins a lot of these kinds of regulatory and legal issues. And, at least for the work that we do, getting the manufacturing sector going again in many parts of the development world is the kind of central challenge that I think we need to think hard about, and to think whether the WTO rules and practices have actually, contributed to that problem rather than overcoming that problem.
Sharon or Anita want to jump in?
Well, I'm uncompromising about this. If people don't have a minimum living, then they don't have decent work. If they don't have safe workplaces, they don't have decent work. If they don't, in fact, have universal social protection, they have no resilience against the kind of shock that we will see, particularly in agriculture, from demand blocks, from indeed the tension between small, often informal work in the farms of small landowners to the big corporates who are indeed exploiting workers in many countries in agriculture, and of course to the irregular migrants who often do the seasonal work. So when you look at all of that, the rule of law, human and labour rights must prevail where to reach SDG 8. And where the workers are in a more informal environment, we have to work out how to formalise those jobs, and as a first step, how to provide a minimum living income that is indeed equivalent to a minimum living wage. What's the intersection of income earned, particularly seasonal work, and the social protection system, or responsibility of employers to create more stable work? So this has to be part and parcel of the way we think about areas of both fisheries and agricultural regulation for global trade.
And I'll just give 30 seconds. Richard said he was a crude development economist. No, he's not. I'm a lawyer who masquerades and tries to teach development economics to lawyers. So that's even worse. But just to say, I'm with Sharon in the sense that as we look at what's happening, again, outside of the WTO, we're looking at commitments in a variety of commodity sectors to this concept of sustainable and responsible supply chains, right? The concept that there should be this basic floor, and that the expectations, rightly or wrongly, I mean, I don't disagree with Richard's perspective on the larger issue of distrust in terms of different advanced versus non-advanced economies, is just that companies themselves are now being asked to engage in this as part of an effort that's being driven by the EU, by the US, to sort of change the nature of supply chains, including in the agricultural sector. I support that. Is it easy to make that effective for the people on the ground? That's a different matter, but the movement is afoot. And so the question is, what should we do about that in the context of the global trading system?
All right, well, we're just about at time. I want to thank Sharon, Anita, and Richard for participating in this great discussion. And I also want to apologize to all the followers out there about the technical difficulties. We really ran into some problems with the WTO platform here. So we just did it towards the normal Zoom, had some problems with the audio. And so again, apologize for that. Well, thank you for joining, and everyone take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, everybody. And Eric, great moderation.